The company painted the tank brown so the leaking molasses wouldn't show. 4 years later, 2.3 million gallons of it burst into the street and killed 21 people. The tank stood on Commercial Street, on the Boston waterfront, and it belonged to the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. Molasses does not sound dangerous. It sounds like something you pour on pancakes. But in 1919, molasses was a serious industrial resource. Distilled, it became ethanol, and ethanol became industrial alcohol, the raw material for munitions during the First World War, and for liquor in the years before it. The company's purity distilling operation fed a steady river of the stuff from Caribbean ships into this single 50-foot steel tank in Boston's crowded North End, a dense immigrant neighborhood packed with tenements, wagons, laborers, a firehouse, and an elevated railway running right past the tank's shadow. To understand why a tank this size sat wedged into a busy waterfront neighborhood at all, you have to follow the money running through it. Molasses converted into alcohol was enormously valuable, and demand had been driven higher by the war. There was also pressure of a different kind on the horizon. Prohibition was arriving, and the company had every incentive to move as much product as possible while the market was strong. A tank that emptied and refilled quickly meant profit. A tank sitting half-built meant delay. That pressure, speed over caution, sat behind nearly every decision that followed. The tank had stood there since 1915, and almost from the first day it was filled, it had been trying to warn everyone. It leaked. Not dramatically at first, but steadily, molasses weeping from the seams between the steel plates, running down the sides, collecting in dark pools at the base. Children from the neighborhood used to scrape it up to eat. Rather than repair the seams, the company did something that looks almost unbelievable in hindsight. They painted the tank brown, so the leaking molasses would blend into the steel and be harder to notice. One man refused to look away. Isaac Gonzales, an employee who worked around the tank, grew so uneasy about the leaking and the groaning that he began checking the structure obsessively, even reporting the noises it made under a full load. He warned that it was not safe. He worried especially about the way the tank behaved when it was full and the weather turned, and he pressed for something to be done about the seams. But complaints from a low-level worker did not move a company with product to move and money to make. The response that did come was cosmetic rather than structural, a fresh coat of brown paint over the weeping steel. Eventually Gonzales quit, unable to keep standing in the shadow of something he was certain would fail. Why was it leaking at all? The answer went back to how it had been built. The construction had been overseen by a company treasurer named Arthur Gell. Gell was a financial man. He had no training in engineering or architecture, and by most accounts could not read a blueprint in any meaningful technical sense. But the company was in a hurry. Molasses shipments were already scheduled, so Gell pushed the tank up quickly. When it was finished, the standard safety test was to fill the structure with water and see whether it held. Water is heavy, and a full water test would have exposed weakness before a single gallon of molasses ever went in. Gell skipped it. By most accounts, the tank was filled with only a few inches of water before it was put into service, essentially untested. The steel itself was a problem. Later analysis found the tank walls were roughly half as thick as they needed to be for the loads they carried, and the steel that was used was brittle, prone to cracking rather than bending, especially in cold. So the tank had been leaking and straining for years, filled and emptied, each cycle stressing metal that had never been strong enough to begin with. The neighbors heard it. The company painted over it. Then came the final sequence. 2 days before the collapse, on January 13th, a fresh shipment of warm molasses arrived from the Caribbean and was pumped in, bringing the tank close to full, near its maximum load for the first time in a while. That warm cargo now sat inside a tank that had spent recent days locked in brutal New England cold, and in the hours before the failure, the temperature outside climbed sharply, rising dozens of degrees in a short span as an unusually mild day settled over the waterfront. Whatever the precise mechanism, the thermal swing, the brittle steel, the strain of a tank loaded near capacity, the structure that had been quietly failing for 4 years reached the end of what it could hold. At around 12:30, The tank began to make a sound the neighborhood had never heard from it before. A deep metallic rumble, like something enormous clearing its throat, then a rapid burst of sharp cracks as the rivets holding the steel plates sheared off one by one and snapped into the air like machine gun fire. Then it let go all at once. The wave that burst out of the ruptured tank was, by most estimates, as high as a 2- or 3-story building at its crest, and it moved through the streets at roughly 35 miles an hour, far faster than a person can run. This is the detail that makes the disaster so hard to picture. Molasses in a kitchen crawls. Molasses released from a 50-foot tank at that volume behaves like a moving wall of solid weight. It did not ooze. It hit. The firehouse nearest the tank, home to Engine 31, was struck head-on. The building was shoved off its foundation, and a firefighter named George Lay was pinned beneath the wreckage and killed. The steel supports of the elevated railway were bent and buckled, a stretch of track knocked out of line. Wagons, horses, and people were simply picked up and carried. A loaded freight car was pushed aside. Nearby houses came off their footings, and because the wave was made of molasses rather than water, it did not drain away. It settled, thick, heavy, and inescapable, over everything and everyone it had caught. 21 people died, and roughly 150 were injured. Some were crushed by collapsing structures and flying debris. Others were pulled under the molasses and could not escape. Because the harder they fought, the deeper they sank into a substance that gripped like glue and would not let a chest expand to draw breath. Among the dead were children who had been near the waterfront in the middle of an ordinary day, including 2 10-year-olds, Pascual Intosca and Maria D'Estacio, alongside teamsters, laborers, and city workers who had been going about a routine Wednesday. The rescue was a nightmare of its own. Sailors from a nearby Navy training ship, along with police and Red Cross volunteers, waded into waist-deep molasses to reach the trapped and the drowning, and every step was a fight. The molasses dragged at their legs, coated their arms, and made it nearly impossible to keep a grip on a struggling person long enough to pull them free. Victims were so completely covered that rescuers sometimes could not tell at a glance whether they had found a person, an animal, or a heap of wreckage. Some of the dead were not recovered for days. When the initial chaos finally slowed, the north end looked like it had been struck by a storm made of tar. Buildings stood crooked on broken foundations. The twisted ironwork of the elevated railway hung out of shape overhead. Wagons, furniture, and pieces of the wrecked firehouse lay half, swallowed in a hardening brown crust that coated the street from wall to wall. What had been a working neighborhood at lunchtime was, by evening, a field of debris that no one could walk across without sinking. The cleanup stretched on for weeks. Crews used salt water and sand to break the molasses down, but by then it had gotten everywhere, into cellars, into the harbor, tracked across the city on the shoes and wheels of everyone who passed through the district. The harbor water was stained brown for months, and for years afterward, people in the North End swore that on a hot day you could still catch the faint smell of molasses rising from the pavement and the cracks in the old buildings. But the story did not end in the cleanup. It ended in a courtroom, and that is where its meaning was settled. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company did not accept blame. Instead, it offered an explanation tuned to the anxieties of the moment. The tank, it argued, had not failed on its own. It had been blown up. Anarchists, the company claimed, had planted a bomb. This was not a wild excuse. The era was thick with real anarchist violence, and bombings were a genuine feature of American life in those years, so a jury might plausibly have believed it. If the collapse was sabotage, the company was a victim rather than a culprit, and it would owe nothing. The survivors and the families of the dead sued, in what became one of the largest and most tangled civil proceedings Massachusetts had ever seen. Rather than a single jury trial, the mass of lawsuits was consolidated and placed before a court-appointed auditor, Colonel Hugh Ogden, who spent roughly 3 years hearing testimony from thousands of witnesses. Engineers, chemists, neighbors, survivors, and company men. It became a battle of experts, each side hiring specialists to argue over the strength of steel and the behavior of a bursting tank. For families who had lost a parent or a child, It meant waiting years for a verdict while the company insisted, again and again, that someone else had set off a bomb. The pressure was on the plaintiffs to prove a negative, that no saboteur had done this, that the tank had killed on its own. The evidence took the bomb story apart. Investigators showed that the steel was too thin and too brittle, that the tank had never been properly tested, that it had been leaking and groaning for years, and that the man who oversaw its construction had no qualifications to do so. The failure had not come from an enemy outside. It had come from rot within, a structure that had been announcing its own weakness to anyone willing to listen. In 1925, Ogden found the company responsible, and it paid settlements totaling in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, an enormous sum for the time, divided among the injured and the families of the dead. The consequences reached beyond the money. The Molasses flood became a lesson in why technical work cannot be handed to people who cannot read it. In the years that followed, Massachusetts and then other jurisdictions tightened the rules around large-scale construction, requiring that engineers and architects actually sign and seal their plans, that calculations be checked, that a company could no longer simply hand a steel tank to its treasurer and hope. The brown wave on Commercial Street helped force a quiet change in how seriously a signature on a set of plans was taken. And that is the part worth sitting with. The tank did not fail without warning. It leaked for years. It groaned on warm days. A worker begged someone to listen and then walked away rather than watch it happen. The one decisive action the company took was not to reinforce the seams. It was to paint them a color that made the leaking harder to see. What poured through the north end that afternoon was not simply an accident that came out of nowhere. It was a warning that had been visible the entire time, covered over one coat of brown paint at a time, until the day the sound changed, and the street filled with something that was never supposed to be there at all.